The views and opinions expressed on the Nova Society are those of the panelists and guests and do not necessarily reflect the views or opinions of the Phoenix Research Institute or any institution which any panel member is associated. Reproduction or dissemination other than for the purpose of education or information without the express written permission of the Phoenix Research Institute or Nova Society Media is strictly prohibited.
I'd like to welcome everyone back to the Nova Society. I'm your host, Dr. Brooklyn Ann Weldon, and I'm here with my panel, Dr. Scott Gershwer and Dr. Mark Bound. Today, our panel welcomes back our guest, Ashok Panikkar, who is a mediator, teacher, and consultant with over 30 years of experience in cross-cultural diversity and conflict management. Ashok proposes democracy cannot be sustained outside of the West, and that it is dangerous to try. Welcome, Ashok.
May I ask a question to the three of you?
Absolutely.
Okay. So I want to pick up on Scott's optimism, and I want to ask all of you, let's just say America gets its act together. Let's just say. And I can't personally, given that I live here, I can't think of a better outcome in 4 or even 12 years. How would American democracy be affected by the rest of the world? Particularly, for instance, last week, or rather earlier this week, we had the BRICS meeting in Russia, where it literally the rest of the world, most of the major powers, regional as well as global powers, are coming outside of Europe, coming together to literally either reform or change the liberal world order established by the US. And many of them are extraordinarily antagonistic to the US and the West. How do you see America, a healthy American democracy and economy? I'll just take that as a given. How do you see that as being affected by an antagonistic world that refuses to play ball with America? And yeah, I'll just stop there.
I mean, I'll take it first. I think that the guy who coined the term BRICS has already kind of said, you know what, it's just not happening for them. And that it's, whereas China and Russia clearly are very antagonistic right now towards the United States of America for various reasons, some of which are fairly legit. I mean, we set this up to benefit ourselves. There is, the post-World War II era has been largely a conflict that ended in 1992 or thereabouts, but that benefited us greatly. I guess they could, if they want to argue that at their expense, I would say, no, I don't believe that. I don't think Putin's going to last much longer if Comrade Harris wins, because his ability to continue doing what he's doing in Ukraine and even threatening other countries now is going to be limited by the shortcomings of their economy, and it's unsustainable. He's losing his puppet here in Trump and others that he was able to manipulate, whether it's McConnell or the other members of the Senate that went over to Russia a few years back, and or whether it's the people who don't know that they're being manipulated by Russian propaganda, find it hard to believe that they are, but are, and are wrong about that. China is already losing a lot of the momentum that it had from I keep wanting to say bridge and tunnel, but Belt and Road initiatives that they had going on in, around the world, as people are like, other countries are wondering what the price of that is going to be, which is largely due to US propaganda, I imagine. And so I don't, the world works better for the people of the world when everybody is just focusing on making money and not ideologies, and not competition. Competition causes blood. Blood is a big expense. And so my hope for the country is that as a lot of these investments that we're just beginning to make now, right? That Biden has put a lot of money into and private industry is pouring money into, but are not yielding benefits yet, will yield benefits. Green energy is an opportunity, not a problem. That cleaning up the environment is an opportunity and not a problem. That will continue to move forward where with a world that is benefiting from peace and a world that is benefiting from capitalism and freedom and just the ability to make money. And I think the shoots of that are this proposed deal between Saudi Arabia and Israel, two ideologies that couldn't be further apart, but where pragmatic leadership is allowed to take control of those narratives. They see that there's benefits to one another, even if they're never going to necessarily see eye to eye on religion and philosophies and other stuff like that. So I'm, call me optimistic on that front. That's the beginning of where we're going.
I think the thing that I would push back on is this concept that the United States is this liberal. If you look at the United States and how we do things, it's far from liberal. We usually follow other people, other countries. We are not the leader that we always try to, seem to be, that we claim that we are. And I know Scott always says we should stop using the term superpower. And he's probably right, because the United States, if you look at the internals of the United States, we're very conservative compared to other countries. I remember, watching TV back in the 1970s, and it was, Monty Python's Flying Circus was like, oh my gosh, they're showing like pictures of boobs. Oh God, how could, and here in the United States, it was like, oh, how can you possibly do that? So in a lot of ways, ideologically, the United States remains, and I don't say far right, I say that they remain rather moderate. If they are liberal, they are moderate in being liberal. You want to talk about liberal? Look at Denmark. You want to talk about liberal? Look at Iceland. Look at any of some of those Nordic countries. They're far more liberal than the United States. Maybe the Germans not so much, because the Germans are the Germans. But again, I think that concept that the United States has is a liberal agenda that the rest of the world may not like, say like the Chinese and all the rest. No, what they don't like is they don't like the ideology of what democracy is. That's what their problem is. Will it impact the United States economy? No, I don't believe that it will, because bottom line, we have to trade. And the Chinese know it, the Russians, everybody knows it. You have to trade. There's certain things that you need that you can get from the United States, and you're not going to get anywhere else. As we, who are always in this battle with China. Trump's Bible was made in China. Come on. We deal with who we have to deal with, and this is not something new. People seem to think that, the idea of political economics is some brand new kind of thing. Political economics has existed since village number 1 traded with village number 2. And it could have only been 10 miles away, which back in the long periods of time ago was a long way to travel. We've just expanded it with technology and our ability to go from one side of the globe to the other within a day. That's the only thing that's really changed. It still exists that we as human beings, and again, it goes back to the evolution of human beings, and it really all comes down to the economy. You cannot live without money. That's all there is to it. Until we change that, which cannot see, we're not going to go to a barter system or something like that. Although at one point in time in our history, we did have barter systems that worked very nicely. But the fact is that, they can be against the United States, but I don't think it's because of liberal ideology, or I think it's because of democracy. And I think the problems that they have are because of internal, because there's this fantasy of what the United States is. And in many ways, it's a fantasy, and has been a fantasy for a very, very long time. even the people of the United States know that the American dream really doesn't exist, not to what we've promoted it to be. And we've made it more than what it actually is. Eisenhower, a car in every driveway, a chicken in every pot. Okay, that's great, but it wasn't for everybody. It wasn't for everybody, and that's all there was to it. So I think sometimes we worry about what the rest of the world thinks, but like Scott brought out, Biden started to invest in some of these, green technologies. We're behind other countries. We're supposedly the technological leaders of the world, and we're behind because we're conservative, or we're moderately conservative. We should have been on top of this. This should have been seen as an opportunity, and we didn't see it as an opportunity. We saw it as a change. And if there's one thing Americans don't like is change. That's going to be my take on it.
Well, again, but there were advantages to outsourcing a lot of our manufacturing, even of the most sensitive technology in the world, to other countries, which we did. Now, because of the shock of the pandemic and the disruption of supply lines, I think we learned that lesson that we have to do these things here. And so, we're building that capacity, but we're still in the building stage. We're not there yet. But once we get there, I think that we'll see a lot of advantages. And again, I think history is going to be a lot kinder to Joe Biden than anybody else was while he was actually the president of the United States, and that his vision has been to win the future, and we are in the process of doing that.
As where Trump is looking to create an alternate future. And I think that that's something that's very important for everybody to remember.
Yeah, I mean, Trump is such a Rorschach test because you can look at him in so many different ways depending on what you want. But again, basically, he's simply a conduit to whatever you want at the lowest possible price. It doesn't cost a lot as far as nations or even large companies are concerned to manipulate him. And he is easily manipulated. The real big difference between the two candidates that we have right now is that he'll do what they want him to do, whoever they is, if they give him what he wants. And the other person is more of a, Harris is more of a institutionalist, where we're going to continue the way we've been all along and not give in to billionaires or other countries who want a piece of us, basically. And so, that's the choice that we face, I think, in a lot of ways on Tuesday.
I agree. Hopefully, Ashok, we answered your question. Sometimes we do, sometimes we don't. It's amazing how,
No, but that's perfectly fine, because I enjoyed listening to you folks, regardless.
I mean, essentially, you were asking what success looks like, right? And I'll tell you one of the things Mark mentioned, housing.
Sorry, that wasn't my question.
Okay,
I'm reinterpreting it.
Yeah.
But go ahead.
We're good at reinterpreting the question.
Tell me what the question was again. I thought you said what does it look like, 15 years from now or whatever.
Well, with the other countries, like the BRICS countries and whatnot. And one thing is with China, as Mark, I think you were saying, their economy is not doing as well. It also, I think, is a question of all those countries getting along together and having the same kind of vision. And right now, I guess Putin has North Korean soldiers on the ground fighting in Ukraine.
Or not fighting, actually, because I don't think they know what to do with them.
Yeah. So, I mean, they've got their own messes, shall we say, in each of those countries. And while an alliance may sound wonderful. I mean, what kind of an alliance is it? Are they going to imitate the UN? Are they going to have a little democracy there where everybody among them is equal? Are they going to have equals with superiors among equals? I mean, how long is their little small, well, relative to the number of countries in the world, small? How long and how well is that going to hold together? And when considering something like the UN, which obviously doesn't function very well, or NATO, for instance, I'm not so sure that something new like this is going to function very well. And I mean, Putin is over 70, and he's certainly not going to live forever. What happens when he gets replaced? And so, I mean, who knows how well an alliance like that is going to do even among themselves. So I don't know if that answers your question.
But this is something that's gone on throughout history. Who would think that the American colonies would be best friends with the British today? Now, if you were to ask back in the late 18th century, not possible. Alliances shift here and there, and they shift for whatever the government of the one country believes is in the best interest of them. So these alliances shift. This BRICS thing, as long as they think it benefits them, they'll be in on it until it doesn't. And then just like it's always been throughout history, let's take, medieval times, the British and the French fought all the time. And then sometimes they were together. And then sometimes they weren't together. And then the Russians were together. World War II, how many countries were involved in World War II they didn't like each other? But it's always a marriage of convenience when we're talking about geopolitics. So I think, if I may be answering the question properly, I don't think it's going to have any effect whatsoever, because we don't know right now how this alliance, will it survive? Does it benefit? Does each individual, let's say India gets into it, does India see it benefits them? If India says it doesn't, they're out. They'll be out quicker, and that's all the countries involved. As far as Brooks' comment about, is this going to be like everybody's equal? No. Even in NATO, there's no equality in NATO. And anybody that thinks that there is fooling themselves. The United States is the big dog. We're the ones with the military with an outrageous budget. We're the ones with all. We even though we may not be in charge of it, as far as having the general that's in charge or the politician that's in charge of it, the United States, when we say something, they jump. Because that's the way it works.
Okay, just to add to what you folks are saying, particularly Brooks' point, I think one of the things that I realize about the rest of the world, and BRICS was just an example. I just threw it out there. I'm not talking just BRICS, by the way. I just threw it out there because it happened last week. But the rest of the world is not used to equal democratic institutions. It's not. Mm-hmm. So let's just take BRICS as an example. Again, I'm not resting my entire thesis on BRICS. So, whether it sustains, whether it survives or not is another matter. But BRICS is very clearly, as Mark said, there are top dogs. I mean, there is no question about the fact that even between India and China, India is huge and these are competitors. But as long as India was one of the founding members of BRICS, as long as India remains in BRICS, it will be secondary to China. And India knows that it can't change that equation. So the idea that, forget India, China, and Brazil, and Russia, and South Africa. If take Pakistan, or take Nigeria, or take any of these countries, they have no illusions about being equal. And it's also important for us to recognize the history of the Chinese empire. China didn't necessarily, outside of the Middle Kingdom, it didn't really go out and conquer lands outside their region. But it survived as the preeminent superpower of that era by having a network of vassal states. And this is how most of the East and the South will maintain will attempt to create stability. And the reason and again, it's like, I totally agree. We have no idea what's going to happen in 20 years. So I'm not prophesizing anything at all. But one thing for me, and the thing that I would stake my whatever, I don't have any money, and I don't have very much of reputation either. But whatever I have, I would stake it on this, that the democratic model is deeply distrusted by the rest of the world outside of North America and Europe. It's distrusted and detested. The only ones who ask for it are dissidents and the marginalized, because they see it as a way to gain something that they don't have. And in my experience, they don't understand democracy at all. So when I ask that question about the US, I'm taking for granted, of course, anything can happen, but I'm taking for granted that even if the US sets its house in order and is thriving, and I think the US is economically sustainable because it's so large, so rich, and it has enough resources. I'm not worried about that. It's entirely possible it'll happen. How would you retain, even if it's a conservative democracy, as Mark said, not terribly liberal, but still a fairly robust democracy in a world where the UN is I think the UN will collapse on its own weight in the next 5 to 10 years. The EU is going to really struggle, primarily because, for all kinds of reasons. That's a different conversation. But when the rest of the world is antagonistic, and it doesn't mean they won't trade. So I'm not talking just about trade. Would any of this affect our mindset here, our investment in maintaining a democracy, our investment in human rights? And it's a question. I don't know the answer.
So could I ask you a question? Do you think that India's leader would have gone to Moscow if they weren't buying oil at like $40 on $100 barrel of oil?
Absolutely. They would. And I'll tell you why. While this is great for India, the oil, India is in a very tricky situation. It is deathly scared of China. And because of Putin's great relationship with Xi, India sees, as much as the US is, Russia can hold back China if it decides to get even more aggressive with India. So India needs Russia, even a weakened Russia. Even if there's no oil there, India still, because of its history with Russia, it has a very positive history with Russia. India sees that China would not try to take liberties more than they're doing now, because if Putin or his successor is displeased, it's a very dangerous environment for India. Very dangerous. It has to get into bed with anyone right now.
Okay. I wouldn't expect that answer, mostly because I think that India is poised or has the potential to be much more powerful than Russia. And, it isn't simply because it hasn't put the resources into its military, let's say, or being a big player on the world stage as much as Russia has.
Right. And you're right. The only thing I would add there is India, even if it decides to expand its military, and it's very difficult. The Indian government, well, that's GDP. It's the fastest growing GDP amongst a certain set of nations. But India is still deathly poor. It can't afford to expand its military the way China did. And here's the other thing. The last thing that China wants is for India to become strong. India is China's basically almost like it's not an Achilles heel, but the uncertain factor. Because China, even if it decides not to be the world superpower, it definitely wants to be and will be the regional power. In other words, China will not brook any threat from Russia or India or Indonesia or any of those other countries. China is ruthless, absolutely ruthless. So another reason why China will keep needling India, whether it's in the Himalayas, whether it's through Pakistan, whether it's through the Maldives and Sri Lanka, and now Bangladesh and Nepal, it basically is trying to keep India so busy with problems in its neighborhood that India cannot ever threaten China.
And yet one other thing that India and China have in common is the fact that you're here. And there's been a huge brain drain from India, right? And I talk about this all the time. The brain drain is really to me, the unsung factor in what makes America as amazing as it is because we bring these entrepreneurs from all over the world to increase our wealth here, where they could be doing that back in their own countries, but their countries aren't set up for that. I'm not exactly sure why you say it's a very poor country. I gather that is the case. I'm not sure why that needs to be something that we take for granted will always be the case.
No, I don't think it'll always be the case. Actually, I don't know. The reason is because we have 1.4 billion people. I mean, there's no comparison between India and the US in terms of complexity. Okay. Second, the yardstick I use is the way China, over a 30-year period, liberated about 600 to 700 million people out of poverty. When India opened up its economy in the mid-90s, and India grew very fast, not as fast as China, it managed to do the same for about 300 to 400 million, which is huge. In historic terms, India's success in alleviating poverty was second only to China, particularly in that period of time. But you're talking 1.4 billion people. And it's impossible for India to recreate in present day conditions China's growth. China can't, as you yourself put it, China's growth days are over. Now, so the world economy has changed. Globalization is no longer what it was 20 years ago. India doesn't have, unless something very drastic happens, a shot in hell of reducing poverty beyond the 700 to 800 million level, which means another 700 to 800 million people who are subsisting, I'm not sure of the numbers here, at something less than $2 a day. So India has a long way to go. Has India done very well in the last 30 years? Yes, but that's relative. It's not like Taiwan or South Korea, which got rich and completely transformed the country. India is like, it's an ocean. It's like, that's why they call it a subcontinent.
I'm trying to see what the average age is in India. I'm just kind of trying to look that up because there's a really interesting article in Foreign Affairs called the Age of Depopulation, and it talks about how so many countries in the world are not replacing their population with young people, and if young people are leaving India to come here, and the country is getting older and poorer, clearly that would be a downfall of it. Boy, I don't see this article isn't talking about India very much at all. Talks about Myanmar and Nepal, but not India.
Well, India has what they call the demographic dividend. Indian population is much younger than in most other parts of the world.
Okay.
And this is a good thing. However, we've been talking about it for the past 20 years. And here's the rub. If India is utterly failing in creating jobs, when you have a huge youth population and you don't create jobs, they create enormous civic and political unrest. These are the people who get out onto the streets because they have no investment in the country, because they can't even In the US, we talk of people continuing to live with the parents. In the US, in a country like India, 600, so I don't know what the youth population would be, maybe about 300 to 400 million people without jobs. I mean, that's a time bomb.
Actually, I found the part about India here in this article.
Okay.
Ashok, I'm surprised to see this, but this is what it basically says here. We know that India is the world's most populous country. We know that it has world-class scientists, technicians, and elite graduates. But it says here, a shocking 7 out of 8 young people in India lack basic skills.
Wow.
That is a lot. And so they have generally a poor enrollment, low enrollment in schools, and generally poor quality of primary and secondary schools. So the skills profile for China is decades, maybe even generations ahead of India's youth today. And so India is going to face challenges due basically to HR issues more than anything having to do with population or prestige or military might or any of those things. It seems like it's mostly an education problem, perhaps due to poverty.
Probably. And I think a lot of some of it's infrastructure too. I mean, I used to listen to Nisha talk about India, where she was from, when we were at Nova together. And she says, it depends on where you are. India is in so many ways so rural that, when you think of all the population they have, it's kind of put into
right. It's on the rim.
Right. It's very, very centralized, and the infrastructure on the interior is almost non-existent in some way. So yeah, be interesting. So that's all the time we have for today's episode. The Nova Society is a production of the Phoenix Research Institute. We'd like to thank our sponsor for this week's episode, the Phoenix Research Group, an independent research consortium offering social issue solutions to NGOs and international government agencies through multidisciplinary, nonpartisan, and unbiased research. We'd also like to thank our podcast partners, Buzzsprout, who hosts the Nova Society, Audacity, our editing partners, Podkite, who does all our analytics, iHeart Radio, where people get their music and podcasts, Apple iTunes, the largest source of music and podcasts on the internet, Spotify, the most popular source for the Nova Society. The Nova Society is available on all these and other quality platforms mentioned in our description. We'd like to thank our listeners. Without you, the Nova Society would not be possible. If you have a comment, a question, or would like to be a guest on the Nova Society, we can be reached at nova.society.podcast@gmail.com. Always remember, the power of society is knowledge. So for Dr. Scott Gershwer, Dr. Priscilla Hobbs, Dr. Brooklyn Ann Weldon, and all of us here at the Nova Society, I'm Dr. Mark Bound. Be well, and we hope to see you again next time.